So, in addition to Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson's fight getting canceled, the other big news coming out of Fight Week prior to the fights happening was when Dana White was asked in a scrum about money fights, and he went on a bit of a rant about whether he feels that fighters who aren't named Conor McGregor should be asking for money fights. So, obviously, I'm just going to let him talk right here. So, here's the clip, and I'll get into some reaction on what I think about it.
What about big names and big stars? When you look at the UFC and some of the biggest names in the organization, does it come down to just biggest fights opposed to who's deserving, who's in the rankings? Because
everybody, listen, I'm getting tired of the term money fights, okay? I want the money fights. I want the money fights. What, are you all going to move down and fight Conor? Listen, there's no bones about it. Conor is the guy. Conor brings in, big gates, big pay-per-view numbers and everything else. Shut up if you don't. If you're not him, shut up, okay? Guys are talking about money fights. I'm like, you're not a money fight, okay? You're not a money fight. You're going to make whatever you're going to make, and if you're a good champion and your fight sells, you're going to do pay-per-views, and you're a partner in the pay-per-view. If you're not that big pay-per-view star, shut up and fight.
Now, this whole money fight thing, this is going to be an argument that's going to go on over and over and over again. This is going to be the first time I'm touching on it, but I'm sure it won't be the last. It comes up constantly. Obviously, when fighters are looking for more money, this thing comes up. When they're looking for a big fight, money fights come up. I agree a lot with what Dana White said, but I think this is one of those things where you have to look at it holistically. So I'm just going to kind of break it down from start to finish, what each side looks at, why they want what they want, if they're reasonable for asking for what they want, and then just kind of go from there. So to start with, I think it's important to note that with the UFC and really any sports business in general, people like to think of things as the sports industry or the sports business. All sports really is it's a subset of the entertainment industry. You're getting paid for entertaining people. The whole idea is to have people entertained. If this was all about pure sport, about who the best athlete is, that's not what all fans are looking for. When you're going to a bar on Saturday night, you're not exactly looking to see who the best athlete is, what the best sport is. You're actually going to have fun. You're trying to bring your friends along. You're trying to have a fun time, a fun experience. That's why when you go to any professional sports game, whether it's your football, hockey, baseball, there's always a lot of stuff going on. Even during the breaks in action, you've got the mascots coming around. You've got the stuff going on the scoreboard where they're trying to keep you active. The whole entire point of these things is that they're entertainment. So if you're a professional fighter, you're not just an athlete. You're not just there to see if you're the best fighter. You're also an entertainer. Entertainer is half of your job. And quite frankly, especially in an individual sport like this, your job and how successful you are, a lot of it relies on how much money you're able to bring in. If in a team sport, a lot of times the team itself is what brings in the money. And a lot of times they kind of split it off where they have their own marketing that they do, but they also have the team. And they try to say, all right, well, if you're a player, so for example, if you're Sidney Crosby for the Penguins or Jimmy Butler for the Bulls, you're not going to talk a whole ton. Your job isn't really to go out there and say, and go on Dan Patrick's show, for example, and say, oh, hey, let's have a fun conversation. Oh, by the way, we're playing the Cavaliers tonight at 7 o'clock on Comcast Sportsnet. Come watch. But in the fight game, especially when you're only fighting a few times a year, your job is to sell. And being able to sell is probably the biggest part of being able to make money for yourself. Because again, the UFC, if you're bringing in a lot of buys for them, they're going to be able to give some off to you, especially if you're a champion when you're getting pay-per-view points. That in that instance, it's the most direct in that. So if you look at Tyron Woodley, for example, he has pay-per-view points. He had pay-per-view points on UFC 209. If they had 1 million buys, he's going to make more than if they have 500,000 buys and so on. So it's important to recognize that a fighter's job is that of an entertainer, and it's also their job to sell the fights. That's very important to understand. When you understand that, when you hear Dana White talking about Conor McGregor and other guys who are the money fights, that makes sense. So again, that was his point. Conor McGregor is the guy who brings in over 1 million buys consistently. He's the guy who brings in more eyes, more viewers, more money for them. So obviously he's going to get more on his own. Whereas the guys who he talks about, who he complains about having issues with money fights, you have like your Michael Bisping, who doesn't necessarily draw that much on pay-per-view, especially his last fight with Dan Henderson. It wasn't a huge hit. You have Tyron Woodley, again, not a huge draw for them. A lot of these guys aren't the biggest draws. Against Stipe Miocic, same type of thing. His fight against Alistair Overeem was pretty big, but that was also the fight card with CM Punk on it. So we're still kind of waiting to see what he can do on his own. But when he's saying, if you don't bring in money, don't call for the money fight, that's his point. And to be quite frank, I mean, it makes sense. It's fairly linear in that way. If you're bringing in more buys and you're a partner on the pay-per-view, you're going to get more money to begin with. So what he's saying is very understandable. From the fighter standpoint, it also makes sense why they ask for the money fight. Obviously, when you are a champion, you get the pay-per-view points. When you're not a champion, in most cases, you're not getting any points on the pay-per-view at all. In some cases, I believe Chael Sonnen had pay-per-view points, even though he was never champion. So in some cases, that is different. But for most guys, when you're the champion, you get your pay-per-view points. So if you look at Tyron Woodley, for example, and he's calling for names like Nick Diaz for GSP, for even Michael Bisping for a short period of time, and as fans, we get on him because we're like, hey, what the hell? Go fight the top contender. You're not really the champ. If you look at it from his standpoint, he doesn't know how long he's going to have the title. When he has the title, if he can get himself a fight against someone who's going to bring a lot of draws in, and he still has a chance to, or he gets to bring a lot of buyers in, and he still has a chance to make a lot of money off of that with his pay-per-view points, that's going to be the fight he wants. So if you're Michael Bisping, I don't blame Bisping for wanting to fight GSP. GSP is probably going to sell better for him than Yoel Romero would. So if you're Michael Bisping, you don't know how much longer you're going to have the belt. You don't know how much longer you're going to have pay-per-view points. You want to have points on the events that are going to sell the most. So for them to ask for that, that's completely understandable. I understand from a selfish reason why a fighter would want that. I don't really blame him for it. But again, if you're looking at the big picture, you gotta. It's a tough mix. You wanna have fights where you feel like the two guys going out are the two best in the world, and you're actually going to find out who the best fighter at that weight class is that night when you watch it. And so when you have this Michael Bisping versus GSP fight, I don't feel like I'm going to find out who the best middleweight in the world is by the end of that night, and that's frustrating to me. Another thing that kind of comes up in this is, another point with the money fight thing is, I believe Luke Thomas was talking about this as well when Tyron Woodley was calling for Nick Diaz, and the point he made was, well, sure, Tyron Woodley isn't a draw now, but if he fights a bigger draw like a Nick Diaz and does well, then he can kind of use that to springboard himself. I don't entirely buy that argument. Yes, obviously, if you're on a bigger card that more people see and you are impressive, you're going to get a bigger rub off of it than if nobody watched you, even if you did very well. But if you look at who the UFC's top stars have been most recently, especially now that all the weight classes are splintered out and there are over 10 champions, you're looking at guys who weren't exactly fighting huge stars to build their name. So if you look at Conor McGregor, for example, he gets into the UFC. He's already kind of a big star out in Ireland. He fights Marcus Brimage. That's not a huge name. Fights Max Holloway. Again, this was back when Holloway wasn't the rising up-and-comer. This was after he had lost to, not directly after, but after he had lost to Dustin Poirier. He wasn't quite yet established as a guy who was going to be a future interim champ, let alone possible champ down the line. Again, that's not a huge name for McGregor to be fighting. He's fighting Diego Brandao, Dennis Seaver, Dustin Poirier. None of these guys are huge money draws. Even Jose Aldo, once he first got booked for that fight and got on the world tour, Aldo isn't a huge draw in his own right. So Conor McGregor turned himself into a megastar without beating a megastar and taking the megastar shine on his way to doing so. A big thing for fighters when they're building themselves up is, for one, you have to be entertaining. You have to be someone that people want to hear from. Your fighting style, usually you want it to be entertaining. Obviously, Chael Sonnen was able to kind of use the typical wrestling style where he'd take you down, beat you up for 15 minutes or 25 minutes. Not entirely flashy, but he was so entertaining on the mic that he was able to become a huge star in spite of that. But you'd like there to be something entertaining about your fight style. You don't want it to be like what Woodley had with his last two fights with Wonder Boy. That's the type of thing where even if he talks great, you fight the way that Woodley fought, it's kind of tough to build off of that in the ring. But you want to be entertaining outside of the octagon, and you also want to find an opponent where you can build a big rivalry with. For Ronda Rousey, that was Miesha Tate. For Conor McGregor, that was Jose Aldo. And having that big rivalry, I feel, is more important than anything else as you're working your way up. Obviously, Anderson Silva was a pretty big star just because people would see him fight. They'd see the Matrix stuff that he does, and they would just want to see him fight again. But once Chael Sonnen came along, that helped Anderson Silva rise even higher. So if you're Tyron Woodley, if you're Michael Bisping, if you're looking to build yourself into a bigger star, at this point, I wouldn't necessarily look for the biggest name. I'd look for the person who you feel like you're going to be able to build the biggest rivalry with, have the best story with, and get people most excited about seeing you against. And then, again, Ronda Rousey, same type of deal. So she fought a bunch of people who weren't really all that well known in Strikeforce up until she got the fight with Miesha Tate. Again, Miesha Tate wasn't a giant star at the time, but those two built up a really good rivalry. Ronda Rousey was able to beat her, went on from there, got into the UFC, beat a bunch of other ladies who on their own really aren't all that big of stars, beat Miesha Tate again, and then from there she was kind of able to catapult her career and work off of it. So again, if the whole idea is you want to build another star, yes, it can help to beat a superstar and try to take some of their shine, but there are more options for you. You don't just have to beat a superstar. You can find someone who isn't the biggest name, get a big rivalry with them, and kind of build off of that. And I feel like Cody Garbrandt's really going to benefit from this. Him and Dominic Cruz don't get along very well. There's a lot of opportunity there. And then along with Dominic Cruz, he's also got the issues with TJ Dillashaw. So again, there's another big rivalry there. There's a lot he can do to work off of with that. And I'd be really interested to see, depending on how he does in that fight, where Cody Garbrandt goes from here. To me, he seems like the guy outside of, I guess if you say John Jones is already there, if you're going to say John Jones is already there, I feel like Cody Garbrandt has the highest potential to be the next big superstar for the UFC.